All right, and we're live for the Playing to Win installment number 74, and I'm back with my friend George Gammon. How you doing, brother?
Doing well, Rich. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, it's been a while, and I kind of took a break from doing this podcast series. Last couple of months have been busy, so with all the craziness in the economy and the FTX, exchange recently collapsing, and a lot of the stuff that I've sort of tripped across in your social media feed on YouTube, I thought it'd be fun to catch up and kind of do a cast together and share some of the stuff that you've been talking about to my audience and bring me up to speed as well, because I'm not on this thing on a daily basis, so I thought it might be fun to do it this way.
Yeah,
So,
for sure.
what have you been up to since we talked to you last time?
Oh man, just creating content and trying to stay ahead of all the madness that we see in the world, not just socially, but more specifically from a standpoint of macroeconomics. I mean, to your point, about a year ago, I think we probably hit the peak in the crypto price point with the. I thought it was a mania, and it doesn't mean that crypto is not a good idea long term. I think that the crypto space will be very similar to the railroads in the 1800s and very similar to the dot-com bubble that we saw in the late 1990s. And that is to say that it's a great technology and it definitely has a future. But whenever you see something brand new like that, everyone piles on and it just turns into a massive, massive, massive bubble. And that's what you get. You get a bunch of frauds, and like whether it was Luna or Celsius or FTX, we'll see how this all plays out here. But it's very easy to do kind of shady business and to make a lot of money when the tide is in. But it's like Warren Buffett says, when the tide goes out, you see who is actually swimming naked.
Mm-hmm.
And, if the tide goes out and you're still wearing your swimming shorts, then you've got a good chance to be successful over the long term because it wipes out all of your competitors. And again, this is exactly what we saw at the railroads. We saw this in the dot-com bust. In fact, I would argue probably the best time to start a web type business was back 2003, 2004, 2005, like 2 or 3 years after you see this massive bust.
Mm-hmm.
So I was pretty critical about the hysteria that we saw, because to me a year ago it was just so painfully obvious. But now I'm actually probably on the other side of the boat saying, well, wait a minute. I know that there's a lot of frauds out here, and we're going to have to see how this plays out. We're definitely not at a level where I would consider capitulation, but it doesn't mean that there aren't some interesting things out there. And the lower the price goes, and the more frauds and the more bankruptcies we see, the more interested I get. And I think that's probably key to being a contrarian indicator or a contrarian investor.
Do you think that the crypto bubble's completely popped and we've let all the extra air out of it, or do you see
No, because I haven't seen capitulation yet. And it doesn't mean that we're not at the bottom. It's just usually if you study financial history,
Mm-hmm.
when you see these types of bubbles, you've got to get to a point where everyone that was really gung-ho about it is just swearing it off.
Mm-hmm.
We never want anything to do with crypto for the rest of our lives. This was stupid. Anyone that gets involved is crazy. It's only going to go down from here. It's going to go to a zero. And then you see the people like Michael Saylor as an example. I've always said that I really like Bitcoin to have a purchasing power outside of the commercial banking system. That's the main reason I like it. But I say for me, knowing when to buy and sell is all about psychology. It's like Jim Rogers says, you've got to buy panic and sell hysteria.
Mm-hmm.
So waiting for that panic, when does it come if it's an asset that you're bullish on long term? And this is applicable to oil, commodities, stocks, crypto, Bitcoin, gold. It doesn't matter. It's just human psychology. And so what I said is, when I see Michael Saylor sell his Bitcoin, I'll know that's the time to buy, right? Because that will represent absolute capitulation. Another thing that I thought would be kind of an indicator would be the Bitcoin conference.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I don't think you've been to this down in Florida, but I went in what did I go? It would have been 2021.
Okay.
I was at the Bitcoin conference, and it was like a circus. I mean, there were 15, 20,000 people there. It was absolute madness. A lot of fun. But I tell people, follow how many people are actually attending the Bitcoin conference annually. And when you see that drop from 15,000 down to 1,000, that's when you start to get interested, right?
I see.
And that's when you want to catch it for the next cycle up. But it always goes back to just Jim Rogers. He's my favorite investor. And if people can just ask themselves, okay, am I seeing absolute panic right now? Or am I seeing absolute hysteria? And if you're not seeing one of those two things, then you usually just sit on the sidelines.
Okay, that's an interesting angle. Do you think that Bitcoin is the same as cryptocurrencies, or is it completely separate?
No.
It's just a commodity.
I do not. I think Bitcoin is definitely superior to the other cryptocurrencies, especially if you're talking about just the jokes like Dogecoin or Shiba Inu or something like that. I think that's pretty obvious. But I would argue that the Bitcoin community got caught up in the exact same type of mania that the community around Shiba Inu or GameStop or Dogecoin, it was the same mentality, right? You got to buy it now. You got to get on the train because it's going to 1 million. And if you don't buy it now, have fun staying poor. Yes, Bitcoin is significantly different, but unfortunately back then, I think the community fell into the same trap. And I mean, you had people like Saylor coming out and said to mortgage your house to buy Bitcoin. And I went on several podcasts back then when the interviewer would ask me, well, why not max out your credit card to buy Bitcoin? I'd be like, I would have nothing, because that's such an insane question. Like I wouldn't even know how to respond. So definitely the underlying asset, completely different. But at the end of the day, we're all human beings.
Yeah, maxing out your credit card to buy anything that's speculative is generally not a good idea. Ask me how I know, as a guy that ran one of the biggest debt settlement companies in Canada. It's like a lot of people show up with that problem.
Yeah. Oh yeah. You've been on the other side of that. Yeah. I forgot with your past business.
Yeah. I saw a lot of people not understanding the basics of the credit card machine. Yeah. Crazy. So what else is going on that you see happening, aside from crypto? I mean, like, crypto will be interesting. I think you're correct. All the chart guys, seem to be saying that we've got another drop, probably somewhere between 8 to 12K.
Yeah.
And I think in the past, historically, like December's been one of the worst months, for crypto. So if it's going to happen, it'll probably happen in the next month. So I don't know. I mean,
I don't start with macro, Rich. I start with macro, then I kind of go down from there. So if you look at the yield curve right now in the United States with the Treasury market, you see that we just have this massive inversion. So in fact, I just did a whiteboard video on this morning, where the 1 month Treasury, the 3 month Treasury is trading higher than the 10-year Treasury and the 30-year Treasury. And it gets even more extreme, where we have the Fed funds rate here, which is the overnight rate that the Federal Reserve pays the banks for keeping their cash at the Fed right now. And that's an overnight rate. That's 3.9%. And we see the 10-year and the 30-year trading under 3.9%. To be precise, when I looked at it this morning, the 10-year was trading at 3.68. So, and I went back in my whiteboard video to 1955. And when you go back that far, if you look at the inversion between the 1 year and the 10-year, it predicted 100% of the recessions we've had since 1955. And there was only one time that it got it wrong, where it actually predicted a recession, but we didn't have one. And that was in 1965. But I'd like to point out that in 1965, the GDP went from 10.1%, as far as GDP growth, went from 10.1% all the way down to 0.2. So a decrease in GDP of 10% over the span of, I don't know if it was like 5 or 6 months, something like that, after you saw the inversion. So this is one of the most powerful, probably the most powerful economic indicator we have. in macroeconomics, and its predictability is just second to none. And right now, it is screaming that the United States is going to have a significant recession, if not depression, going into 2023. Maybe in the middle, maybe the end. The timing gets a little difficult there. But whenever you see the curve inverted this much, it's not a matter of if, it's only a matter of when. So why does that matter to people that are interested in crypto or gold or commodities or anything like that, or real estate for that matter? It's because when we go into a recession, you can just go back and look at March of 2020. Look what the stock market did. Go back to 2008, 2009. Look at what assets that the price does. It goes down because it's risk off, risk off, risk off. Everyone wants to just buy dollars, go into cash, or they want to buy bonds, which is why you get the inversion in the curve, because all these large pools of money are trying to hedge their book. They're trying to hedge their portfolio by buying bonds because they think that the economy is going to get so bad that they're going to either lose on their bull positions, or they're using it as a capital gain opportunity because they think the Fed's going to pivot as a result of the bad economic news. And then they're going to get a capital appreciation because there's an inverse correlation between the price of the bond and the actual interest rate. So my point there is that if you're asking me, are we at the bottom of crypto? I would say probably not, looking at the yield curve, because if it is right, like it has been since 1955, then we're in for a lot more pain before we see kind of the light at the end of the tunnel.
Does that also apply to the stock market?
Yes, absolutely. Applies to the stock market, and it applies to the price of gold. Now, a lot of people have seen that gold has really gone up because the inflation rate in the United States has started to tick down. We call that disinflation. And so the market is predicting that the Fed is going to what we call pivot. They're going to stop raising rates a lot sooner than the market had expected. So then you get that interest rate differential between the Fed's overnight rate and maybe some of the other central banks, which could be negative for the dollar, which means gold rips higher. But let's go back and look at what happened to gold in March of 2020, when the market freezes, the credit markets freeze, and people have to sell anything on their balance sheet that's liquid. That's usually gold. So you see the price absolutely plummet. The exact same thing happened in 2008 when Lehman Brothers went bust. You would think that the price of gold would skyrocket. No, it absolutely tanked. But that was your buying opportunity, because the way the central planners and the authoritarians and the central bankers, the way they quote unquote fix the problem is by doing all of these programs like quantitative easing and, or if you want to call it money printing, we'll use that term loosely. And that's always very, very bullish for the price of gold. So it's pretty much any asset that you can think of, whether it's commodities, stocks, precious metals, real estate, crypto, everything other than just cold hard cash and treasuries. And that's why for my own portfolio, I've got a lot more dry powder today than I usually have as far as an overall percentage.
So, okay, well, I mean, you talked about cash is what you like a lot of right now. Is there anything on the markets that you're eyeing right now or buying? I mean, it sounds like you're basically saying stay away from just about everything right now, but is there anything that you like?
Yeah, I'm actually buying short-term T-bills. So when we look at the maturities there, I've been buying 6-month and 1-year T-bills in my own portfolio because long-term, I'm a huge fan of commodities. I think we're going into an energy crisis due to everything the World Economic Forum is doing, the global elite, the IMF, the Klaus Schwab types, in regards to climate change. So I think we're going to have a huge shortage in energy, which is going to make the price skyrocket. But this is over the next 10 to 15 years. Usually super cycles play out over a decade. And we've seen the price of commodities that I really like long-term, such as coal and copper, run significantly over the last, call it 2 years, really since March of 2020. So I don't want to chase the price. Again, we want to buy things when they're cheap and sell them when they're expensive. And they're not cheap right now. So having that long-term view, what I want to do in the interim, in the short term, is buy short-term T-bills, these 6 and 1 year, because the interest rate is very high relative to where I think the interest rate is going to be in 2023 if the bond market and the inversion in the yield curve is correct.
What
So
is the
if we kind of
yield currently on those T-bills?
I'm looking at my board here. The 1 year, just to give an example, is at 4.7.
Okay.
4.7%. So what happens if you were to buy these T-bills today? Let's go over a worst case scenario. The worst case scenario is if nothing happens to the price of commodities or whatever asset you want to buy with this dry powder, and you just hold them to maturity. And then at the end, you just get 100% of your principal back plus 4.7%. That's the absolute worst case scenario. And now in the United States, you can say, George, well, you're still losing purchasing power because the rate of inflation is higher than that. And I completely get it. I agree. That's kind of the cost you pay for having that liquidity. But if you're in Canada, or if you're in Europe, the UK, Australia, or where I'm in Colombia, where your expenses are denominated in another currency, it might not matter if the dollar continues to appreciate against the currency that your expenses are denominated in. Right? Because you don't, as a Canadian citizen, as an example, you don't care what the inflation rate in the United States is. Because if you buy a 1 year T-bill and that's denominated in dollars at 4.7%, and during that time frame, let's say the inflation rate in Canada is 5%, but the dollar appreciates 10% against the Canadian dollar, you got a double whammy right there. You see, whereas if your expenses are denominated in dollars, then it's a little bit of a disadvantage because you're definitely going to lose that purchasing power because 4.7% isn't keeping up with the rate of inflation. But for me, it's just like kind of buying an insurance policy. Now, let's look at what happens if it works out and if the yield curve is correct. Well, then the Fed is going to drop rates, let's say back down to zero. Well, if they drop rates back down to zero because of an economic recession, what's going to happen to the yield on the 1 year treasury? That's going to go straight down. So let's just say that the yield goes from 4% down to 1%. Well, that's a capital gain for the person that owns that treasury because, again, there's an inverse relationship between the price and the interest rate. So interest rate goes down, price goes up. So then you have more purchasing power than you had before. And if you want to sell, let's say after 6 months. So let's just say as a result of this recession, the demand side plummets for commodities. So that's going to bring down the price of all the stuff that I want to buy to a level that I would consider quote unquote cheap. So you kind of get a double whammy there. Instead of just keeping your cash in the checking account making, let's say 50 basis points, you keep your dry powder in a T-bill where if everything plays out the way you think it's going to play out, you're going to get a capital gain on the dry powder, which will allow you to buy more of the cheap commodities that you want to hold over the next decade. That's kind of my current game plan.
I think you made reference last time we talked to uranium.
Oh yeah,
that is an industry and is
Love
Are
it.
you still hot on that or?
Absolutely. I mean, let's go through all of the mistakes that have been made in the European Union in relationship to Putin, Russia, and Ukraine.
Yeah.
I mean, the first thing that they do is they come out and they do all these sanctions. Well, how did that work out for them? Right? I would argue that those sanctions impacted the European Union far more negatively
Agreed.
than it impacted Russia. But you see that the price of energy just absolutely skyrockets to the point, unfortunately, where this winter, a lot of people over there might not be able to afford, just heating their home, which is, by the way, is another problem that we have here in the United States with diesel up in the Northeast as a result of these crazy policies towards Russia, which, I'm no fan of Russia, but I am a fan of doing something to them that will hurt us less than it hurts them. Kind of common sense and a cost benefit analysis. But anyway, let's go back to 1980. And we had the Green, or maybe it was 78. That's when the Green Party started in Germany. And their battle cry, one of their battle cries back then, Rich, was to get rid of nuclear. We got to get rid of nuclear, got to get rid of nuclear. So along in the 1990s, along comes this politician who's, of course, Machiavellian, and he sees an opportunity there. He doesn't give a He doesn't care about the polar bears or the temperature in the ocean. He just sees this as an opportunity to usurp power and control. His name is Gerhard Schroeder. So Gerhard Schroeder comes along and he says, okay, Green Party, I'll go ahead and pander to you guys. And at the time he wasn't part of the Green Party, but he kind of combined them. And he said, okay, if I get elected, then I'm going to go ahead and get rid of all this dirty, horrible nuclear energy. So he does that. In the early 2000s, he gets rid of the nuclear energy. But what does he replace it with? He replaces it with a pipeline going straight to Russia for nat gas called Nord Stream. Maybe you've heard of it.
Yeah.
Right. So in an effort to pander to his constituents, they take a source of a very, very clean energy and they replace it with something that's far more detrimental to the environment. And they make themselves completely dependent upon Russian nat gas and therefore giving Putin all the leverage in the world. And so fast forward to today, when they go ahead and implement these sanctions, now what do they because they don't have the nat gas. So what are they having to transition to? Well, now they're having to use more coal, than they ever have in the last, let's say, 30 or 40 years. And some people are literally having to go out and cut down timber wood, like in their backyard, just to heat their house, which has probably a bigger impact on the environment than coal does. So my point here is that all these central planners and authoritarians and all these people, excuse me, that are really Malthusians at heart. I call them the Malthusian cult. And that's the World Economic Forum. That's the EU, the UN, the IMF, and all of their cronies. And unfortunately, they've got a lot of influence over corporate America as well. But these people truly believe that there are too many human beings on the planet Earth relative to the amount of scarce resources we have. So they have two objectives. One is to make sure that people use less energy, and they're doing a very good job of that right now in Europe. And number two is to decrease the population, like Bill Gates always talks about. But, they won't say, well, we want to actually kill people, but they'll say, well, we want to reduce the population growth, or we want to reduce the birth rate, something like that. So these are their two objectives, going all the way back to when Klaus started the World Economic Forum in 1971, right? And the Club of Rome in 1968. You guys can do all the research. I've done a lot of whiteboard videos on this. But the point here is that climate change is just a Trojan horse. It's just a way to allow them to use a marketing tool, right, to really package what their true objectives are, because using less energy, therefore lowering the standard of living for the entire globe, or just killing, half the people, half the population, call it 4 billion people, that doesn't really sell. So you got to use some marketing strategy there and package it a different way. So my point is, we see this climate change narrative, and I'm all for clean air. I want to be very, very clear. But what I'm saying is the people pushing this narrative, most of them, especially at the top, they don't care about clean air. They only care about those two objectives, usurping power and control, right? So
what do you think's in it for them? Because I always like to ask that question when it comes to these ideas. Like, what's in it for these conglomerates to reduce and eliminate more of the population?
There's several things there. First and foremost, it's their religion. They truly believe they're doing good. So I think if you and I sat down with Klaus and had a couple beers, I don't think he would come out and say, ha 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 ha, I love murdering people. I think he would exactly
right.
Exactly. I think he would say, listen, the fact of the matter is that Thomas Malthus was right, that if we have exponential population growth in a world with limited resources, at some point that has to bring down the standard of living for all the people in the world, because energy is the economy. People have to realize that. You can look at a chart of our energy use globally, and it tracks perfectly with GDP growth and the global population. So if we have access to more and more energy, if we're able to use more energy, that's going to increase the standard of living for the people in aggregate total. So if we have access to less energy, because the population is growing exponentially and the amount of energy you have access to flatlines. The only thing that can happen is the standard of living coming down. So Klaus would say, we don't want that to happen. So in order to prevent that, unfortunately, we've got to make some hard decisions. And a hard decision is we've got to create an equilibrium between the population and the environment in which we live and the amount of resources that we have access to. And in order to do that, you've got to reduce the energy use in the rich countries, and you've got to reduce the population in the poor countries. And why would he say that? Because the poor countries are the ones that they really have to focus on, because they're the ones that go from, first of all, right now, they're using a lot less energy than we are in the West, right? And if you've ever been to like Ecuador or something like that, you know what I'm talking about. They're living in a brick kind of hut thing here, and they're riding around on a bicycle. But what happens is, as their GDP grows, then they use more and more energy, because they go from riding a bicycle to riding a scooter, and then they go from riding a scooter to driving a little car, and then they go to driving a truck, and then what they eat changes as well. They go from just eating rice, and then they start eating more and more protein. Well, protein requires a lot of energy. And so the Klaus types, they see that and they say, okay, well, we understand that human beings are hardwired to always want something better for themselves and for their children and for the generations to come. So we can't prevent them from going from a bicycle to a moped. That ain't going to happen. So what we have to do is we just have to lower the population in those areas that have those types of or that, basically everyone is going to want that opportunity. So we just have to decrease the population in aggregate total. Now, I think they'd say that, maybe after 2 beers, Klaus would say, okay, well, we want to do that by just discouraging population growth, just like the one-child policy in China, as an example. So we just want to, promote birth control, or we want to promote the idea that people should just have 1 child or 2 children or whatever. But I think after about 4 or 5 beers, then it would turn a little darker as far as the conversation. And it would go from, well, we need to promote having fewer children, to we need to enforce this from a top-down standpoint. And then maybe after 10 beers, you'd get to the Thanos plan, which is what I call it. And if you saw that movie, exactly, you got it.
So, I mean, here's what's really interesting about that. I know Justin Trudeau is one of Klaus Schwab's best buddies.
Oh, he's a disciple. He's like a Klaus Schwab mini-me.
Yeah, and there was an article or a conversation piece that came out from Max Bernier, who's like the main opposition, who doesn't even have a seat in parliament, but he's the guy saying, we need a little more freedom, less rules, lower taxes, get out of my life, stay out of my pockets, and get the hell out of here, sort of thing. And Trudeau's been talking about increasing the immigration rates into Canada, which kind of contrasts, the whole notion of lowering population density, energy usage, and all that, right? And I think the number was doubling, if I'm not mistaken. So why double your immigration rates into Canada if you're drunk on the Klaus Schwab Kool-Aid to lower the population, reduce population, lower energy consumption, when that in theory would be the opposite? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I do. I think, number one, it's part of this woke narrative. So a lot of times that conflicts with the overall main objectives of the global elite. But also, too, if you look at what truly does lower population, it's when people become richer. So, and Bill Gates will tell you that it's when people become healthier. That's complete BS. He's just trying to sell you, some oceanfront property in Arizona just to push his narrative. But when people get richer, they do have fewer kids. And so that could be it, when they're trying to bring all these people from maybe poorer countries into the richer countries, assuming that their standard of living will increase, therefore they'll reproduce a lot less.
That's an interesting theory. Okay. So take them out of an environment where they'd normally have four or 5 kids, put them in one where they might have 1 or 2.
Yeah, exactly. And not only that, but to put them into an environment where they will vote for you. so you can continually stay in power.
Well, they
That may
clearly
be
do
the
that.
thing.
Yeah.
There's probably a lot of reasons why they may push that narrative or
Mhm.
that agenda.
It doesn't seem to be slowing down, though, does it?
No, in fact, it's well,
I mean,
there
like the
are,
craziness.
yeah. What I always say is that every night I go to bed and I think to myself, well, the good news is it can't get any crazier. And then I wake up the next morning and read the news.
You know, you know, it's funny. You know, I did this reaction piece to Jordan Peterson's 3-part series on the Daily Wire about encouraging guys to marry. If you haven't seen it, you should go watch it on the Unplugged Alpha podcast. It's from like 2 weeks ago. And because I subscribed to the Daily Wire, I figured, you know, I'd check out what was on it. And I saw this one that caught my eye, which was What is a Woman by Matt Walsh. And
Oh, right.
I don't know, that was a 90-minute train wreck. Like by the end of it, by the time I was done, I just looked at my girl and I was like, I don't really belong in this world. Like, I don't agree with any of this. That's not me. I'm not nodding my head here. It's just,
I can totally relate, Rich.
you
I
know,
can totally relate.
it's like, where are we going here, man? Like, is this really what's becoming so common? And every time, I look around, it's like, well, that's batshit crazy. And there's more of this batshit crazy stuff over here. And it's like, am I the only one that's still sane? That whole code in the matrix sort of thing. You were talking in a few videos in the past month on your YouTube channel. If you guys haven't subscribed to George Gammon, do so. He has 2 channels, George Gammon, and another one called The Rebel Capitalist. He also runs a live event, so definitely check him out if you don't know about him. But you were talking about the psychotic plans of these global elites. Can you dive into that a little bit more and why that's such a huge risk to us in the economy right now?
Yeah, I mean, we were talking about a lot of their psychotic plans earlier, but from a standpoint of macro, the gal at the UN, her name is Rebecca Greenspan, if I'm not mistaken. I know that last name is correct because I remember it was the same as Alan Greenspan.
What is her position there?
She is the head of the economic department. I can't remember exactly what her title is, but she's the one that kind of goes out and tells the media what their economic policies or prescriptions are.
Oh, so she's providing the sound bites to media outlets then.
Yeah, and she's the one that gets interviewed and all those things.
Got it. Okay.
And so her counterpart over at the IMF is a gal called Christina, or it's like Georgiova or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And you can tell that these 2 gals that are probably the most powerful over in Europe, and Christine Lagarde at the IMF, or she was at the IMF. Now she's the head of the ECB, and Janet Yellen. They're all kind of, I think they all get the same script. So when you hear what they're all saying, if they're saying the same thing, I think it kind of gives you an edge to know what they will be pushing within the next year. And then you can assess the probabilities of it coming to fruition. And then you can see if the mainstream media really starts picking up on this, and if the Federal Reserve starts picking up on this as well. As an example, back in 2019, when I first started my YouTube channel, I was talking about a central bank digital currency. And Rich, everybody was telling me that I was a conspiracy theorist.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, George, you're fear-mongering, you're Alex Jones, you're a tinfoil hatter, blah, 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 blah. Well, now, I'm sure this isn't a surprise to any of your viewers, that now the Federal Reserve has come right out, and not only are they talking about a central bank digital currency, they're testing one. That's right. They've got a pilot program right now, a 12-week program as we speak, where they're testing a central bank digital currency.
How are they testing it? Can you dive into that? Because I haven't got the details, and can you explain why that's such a big risk to us?
Yeah, let me get there in one moment.
Okay.
But one of the key crazy things that they're scripting now, which we may see come out in the future, what Janet Yellen and Rebecca and Christina and Christine Lagarde, what they're talking about is capping interest rates with the central banks. So I think that the central bank in Canada, correct me if I'm wrong, has been increasing interest rates along with the ECB, and everyone knows that the Federal Reserve is doing this. And their position is, hey, if you continue to do this, you're going to create unemployment or further unemployment. You're going to increase the unemployment rate. And that's not fair to the poor and middle class, blah, 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 blah. So what we need to do is we need to increase interest rates just to a point where it starts to negatively impact the unemployment rate. And then what we need to do, if we still have inflation, is we need to send out stimmy checks for people to afford the higher prices for gas, food, shelter, etc. Now, for those of your viewers who are rather sophisticated, they'll say, well, that's complete insanity because that's only going to exacerbate the problem of consumer price inflation. But they've got a solution there, quote unquote. I think what they're going to come out with and what they've talked about is price controls. So they're going to say, okay, Fed, you can only take rates up to, let's say, 5%. And once we see the unemployment rate notch up from 3.7, let's say, to 4.2, now all of a sudden we've got to drop rates back down to, let's say, 4% to make sure that we're not damaging the poor and middle class. And then if inflation is still at, let's say, 5, 6, 7, 8%, then we need to start sending out stimmy checks again. And then we need to cap inflation because we know that that's produced exclusively by just greedy capitalists. We know that's the reason for inflation. So let's just stick it to the greedy capitalists that are trying to stick it to the average Joe and Jane, and we'll implement price controls. So I just want to mention that because I think that your community should kind of just take a mental note there and start trying to notice this narrative being talked about more and more and more throughout the mainstream media, because if they do that, they'll be able to understand what the probabilities are that this comes to fruition. And if it does, you'll definitely need to understand that to position your portfolio in a way that's going to make sure that you're not only surviving the storm, but hopefully you're thriving through all these insane policies. Now, going back to the central bank digital currency question, this is really interesting. Most people understand that if there is a central bank digital currency, that means they're going to be able to monitor every single transaction you do. You meaning every business, every person in the entire population, the entire society. So this is Orwellian on steroids. I mean, this is a dystopian nightmare, to say the least. But that's not where it ends. What most people don't understand is a central bank digital currency means that your dollars or your Canadian dollars, whatever you have in your checking account, which is currently a liability of your local bank, let's say down here in the United States, it's Wells Fargo or Bank of America, that would become a liability of the Federal Reserve. In other words, your checking account would move from Bank of America over to the Federal Reserve. Just like JP Morgan has an account with the Fed. We call it bank reserves, a reserve account, or Goldman Sachs, something like that. So why does this matter? Because there's a big key distinction between the Federal Reserve and your local bank. Your local bank doesn't have an infinite balance sheet. They actually are a for-profit business. So they have to worry about a P&L, right? If they can go bust, they can be insolvent. Now, the Federal Reserve doesn't have that problem. They have an infinite balance sheet. They can have negative equity. It doesn't matter. They're not going to go out of business. So what this means, if everyone has an account with the Fed, it means that they can start issuing credit based on narrative, not based on merit. See, right now, if you go out and apply for a loan for a house, let's say $1 million, well, they're going to look at your credit score. They're basically going to look at your ability to pay the loan back. But I think in the future, especially if we move to this central bank digital currency and they start to ban cash, they're going to say, well, I mean, we need to do what's the word Trudeau would use? Well, we need to employ equity or inclusion or fairness.
It's a social credit score is where you're going.
Yeah, we need to have a social credit score, and what we need to do.
They won't say it.
But basically, we need to extend credit to those disadvantaged groups.
Right.
So whether it's African Americans or
they're already starting to do that right now with banks, from what I've seen, where banks are offering discounted rates or lower rates to people in certain groups that sort of go with the woke narrative, if you know what I mean.
And I think they're going to do it to a greater degree in the future, especially if they get the central bank digital currency, because they don't have to worry about being paid back. In fact, just the other day, I did a video that the Bank of Canada, or is it the Royal Bank of Canada, your central bank up there, just hosted a conference on basically being woke. And the Federal Reserve down here tweeted about it, saying, "Oh yeah, isn't this awesome that the Bank of Canada is doing this whole conference to try to figure out how central banks can be more woke and have more inclusion and diversity and equity." So if you combine that woke narrative with a central bank digital currency, what that means is if you're a straight white guy, then you might get that mortgage, but it's going to be at 10%. And if
Because you're a
you're
straight white guy.
if you're a trans Native American, a furry or whatever it is,
Sure.
then your interest rate is going to be at 1%. And this is one of the many, many reasons that I think a central bank digital currency is so dangerous, above and beyond just the 1984 Big Brother element of it.
You know what's been interesting about all this over the last few years, especially in Canada, is the Trudeau government's slowly been disarming Canadians. I don't know if you know about this, but they've banned handguns, and they're also talking about banning semi-automatic long guns. So we have three categories of guns here. We have restricted, which is really only for security and licensed, police forces. We have non-restricted and prohibited, right? Prohibited are like the full automatic M16s that the military would use, for example, but they're licensed to carry it. But they're talking about taking away long guns that are even semi-automatic, which is the next step. So I'm not sure really what the country's going to look like in 5 to 10 years time, but it's not going in a very nice direction, a very free direction. And CBDCs have been talked about a lot over here. They're dangerous. They're dangerous because they can program the money. They can program, where you can spend it, how long the money's on your balance sheet for, forcing you to spend it within a week or two.
And not only that, Rich, now they're coming out with these credit cards, and these are being pushed by the World Economic Forum, by the way, that show your carbon footprint monthly.
Yeah.
So I think where they're going with this is, to your point, that programmable money. They'll give you a set allocation of carbon credits throughout the month. So let's say that it's the 25th of the month, there's 5 days left, and you've eaten too many steaks, or you've filled up your truck too many times, or your McLaren, it only gets 6 miles to the gallon or whatever. Yeah. Well, now you literally cannot buy any more gas. You can't buy any more steak. You can,
or they might sell it to you, but at a tax rate that's much higher, right?
Or you'd have to pay like triple the price or something like that. Yeah. And how would they do that? Because that money is programmable, and they can make it do anything they want based on their algorithm or your spending habits.
There's really no way to circumvent this either, right? Because they're forcing you to use cash.
That's why I always say that it doesn't seem like a big deal banning cash. Like, who cares? No one ever uses it. But
cash,
when
gold,
you really think
Bitcoin.
It through, that's the only thing that stands between our freedom and liberty and the central planners and authoritarians.
But the way they're going, the vast majority of the population who all, is drunk on the wokeness and wants to protect the environment and save the baby seals and make sure the icebergs aren't melting, they're probably going to line up to go and get these like carbon credit cards.
Oh, yeah.
Just so they can virtue signal on social media. I guarantee within the next year, you'll see circles on fucking Facebook with, I got my carbon credit card. I'm saving the environment. Here's my number over here. There's going to be a lot of people that will rush to that, I believe, anyway. I don't know. What do you think?
They're the useful idiots. I couldn't agree more. Yeah. I could not agree more. And I think what will make it even more impactful is not only this virtue signaling element that you're referring to, but also I think this is how they're going to distribute universal basic income.
Yeah,
so they'll say in order to get the UBI, the $1,000 a month, you've got to go to your phone and you've got to download the Fed app, right? And that Fed app automatically gives you that account at the Fed. So they're creating bank reserves, putting them in your account and letting you spend them as legal tender. But those tokens that you're getting, bank reserves, let's just say that they're called Fed coin, right?
Yeah.
That is the programmable money. And they're just going to use that to weed out all of the existing money and replace it. So 100% of it is programmable, while at the same time banning cash. And then you're screwed and you're done.
Is there a potential catalyst that could reverse this? Is there something that could go wrong? Like what could go wrong with this, if anything?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So here's the good news. The good news is we, the people, have the power to prevent all of this from happening. And I would use as an example the fall of the Soviet Union.
Mm.
You know, Romania was one of the last strongholds there. And they had this guy, I can't recall his name, but he was just an extreme dictator. And he had been in power for 2-3 decades. And he was absolutely ruthless. He controlled the military. Obviously, you weren't allowed to own guns or anything like that. He controlled the media. He controlled the police, everything. And so they started to protest because they wanted to be released from the stronghold of the Soviet Union, because they saw all the other countries on the periphery doing the exact same thing. And they wanted democracy. You know, they wanted free market capitalism. So what he would do whenever a protest would start up is he'd just literally shoot the people. Just go out there and you're dead. So everyone was just living in fear. But at a certain point, you had enough people to where they kind of achieved escape velocity from a standpoint that they couldn't kill everybody. So you had, let's say, 50 people go out to the street. Then all of a sudden, the next day, it was 10,000. And then the next day, it was 100,000. And then it got to the point where it was like 500,000 people that were all protesting in their main square there in the capital city. And he came out to address the entire crowd, and they basically started to boo him and whatnot, which was absolutely unheard of. 9 days later, the dude was dead. They took him out back and just shot him. And they didn't have any guns. They didn't have the power of the military. They just had the power of large numbers, right? And that's what we have to remember as Americans, as Canadians, as Australians, as people who value their freedom and liberty, that if we get pissed off enough, if we unite, we have all the leverage. We have all the power and the control. Another example I'll give you is back in the lockdowns. You know, Phoenix is a city that I'm very familiar with, and they're very pro-gun. And they have about 4 million people. Okay. Well, the government came in and locked everyone in a cage, like they did in so many places back in 2020. And sure, there were people that were protesting, and almost every person, let's say, had a gun. Now, if 1,000 guys, let's say alpha dudes, went out there with their guns, yeah, that might make a dent, but within a day or two, the military would just completely wipe them out. They would not have a chance against the police and the military, especially the federal government got involved. But let's just assume that with no guns whatsoever, all 4 million people in Phoenix, when they instituted the lockdowns, just said no. No, I'm not staying in my house. I'm going to go walk my dog. No, I'm not going to close my business. In fact, we're open 9 to 5 today. All the teachers said, no, we're not going to stop teaching the kids. And the parents said, no, I'm not going to stop taking my kid to school. All 4 million people with no guns, just peacefully practicing civil disobedience. You know, what would the government do? Nothing. There's nothing they would have just said, okay, I guess we're not doing that. Let's move on to the next thing, right? So that's the good news. And that's what's so awesome about the internet. And it's so amazing about what you do and other people that are, I would say, in the freedom and liberty space. I know your main focus is on kind of, the sexual dynamics between men and women. But I think you're like me. My main thing is macroeconomics, but still the freedom and liberty message really seeps into everything that we do. And that's what I think is that's what I'm really optimistic about.
Yeah, I'm not as optimistic as you in that regard, because I live in Canada, so I see it from a different angle. One, we don't have guns like you guys do. The other thing too is it looks like the people here are, it's a whole like boiling the frog slowly, like it doesn't know it's being boiled sort of thing. I think they're dripping out the wokeness and the nonsense and the narratives and the CBDCs and all this sort of stuff and the banning of the guns. And the next thing that the government's doing right now, which is really interesting, I don't know if you heard about this bill in Parliament. I think it's called Bill C-11, but it's basically going to allow the government to control all streaming services.
Oh,
so
yeah, the internet censorship.
Yeah, basically they've had control, like over radio waves and television broadcasting in Canada in the past, but now they're trying to expand that to YouTube, Netflix, and all these other programs. And they're trying to do it under the guise of, we want to make sure Canadian content is, there, like it's got a representation, blah, blah, blah. There's no
free
hate
of misinformation and disinformation,
hate speech, misogyny, like all that sort of stuff. But the underlying notion of it all is because people have looked at the code in this sort of matrix as well too, is no, this is going to give the government full control over information. So while we have the internet today and we have, freedom of information today, there could be a time in the very near future in Canada anyway, I don't know when that's going to come to the States. It seems like the US is a few years behind us, where they are going to have a lot more control over the information that goes. Like it's gotten to the point where there's been some Canadian YouTubers that have lobbied against this bill in Parliament. And I've had people reach out to me like, is this something that you're interested in? Like, you want to get involved? And I did this back in 2012 and it was a waste of time. So my view is I'm just going to let them do what they're going to do anyway, because that's what they do here. And I'll take a look at the legislation when it passes. And if it forces me to move out of Canada, then that's something that I'll have to consider at that time if it's an option. But I think America is probably better positioned than Canada to deal with resisting, the tyranny that's coming from these psychotic plans, as you called them. We'll see where it unfolds, though, man. It's going to be an interesting time over the next 5 to 10 years or so. Let me drop a couple of these super chats on the screen and address them. Sam says, will a credit score be replaced by social credit score? What do you think about that?
Yes. Easy question.
I think it's going to blend the two together, where it's like, I don't think your credit score is going to matter as much as your social credit score right now. What matters?
I think they might just, your credit score might impact your social score. Yeah. But I think that's going to be what's most important.
Yeah. It's certainly going to expand beyond that, because like right now, when you go to a bank and you try to get a mortgage or you want to borrow money, they're basically looking at your income. What are you going to collateralize it with? What does a house look like? What's the appraised value, stuff like that. They don't really care about your opinions online, but my take on it, because money doesn't really have any value. Like, why are we paying taxes if they can print an unlimited supply of money? Is, one of the regular arguments that you'll always hear. But the whole social credit score will let them determine whether or not they want to give you something, or if they want to give preferential treatment to someone else because of their narrative. And then Sam follows up and he says, after the fall of the Soviet Union, a lot of bureaucrats in Moscow were drinking themselves to death while their wives were shopping in Western Europe.
Yeah. Yeah. And, one thing I'd like to remind your viewers who maybe might be on the fence about the whole misinformation, disinformation, saying, well, maybe I can see some advantages there. Just ask yourself the question, when throughout history have the people that have pushed censorship been the good guys? The answer is never. Never. So it's very safe to say that whatever group, I don't care if it's Trudeau, I don't care if it's a government department, I don't care if it's Klaus, whoever starts talking about the benefits of censorship and the evils of misinformation and disinformation, you should not just ignore them, but you should put them in the bucket of people that that are evil themselves. I think that's a good litmus test right now. That if, again, it doesn't matter who they are, if they start talking about that, especially if they're in government, about misinformation, disinformation, and using that as kind of a buzzword and talking about the benefits of censorship, you've just got to initially assume they're evil until they prove you otherwise.
So there's a hearing now on the truckers convoy, which we had here earlier this year. And, the Trudeau government and his cronies are all being examined on this. And it's come to light that, so we have a security agency here. It's called CSIS. It's very similar to the FBI and, stuff like that. Apparently the government, regardless of what the security agency's laws say, pass the Emergencies Act based on their opinions, not based on the law now. So the Liberal government's opinions now supersede law here in Canada, believe it or not.
Jeez. But, looking at the silver lining there with Canadians, I know that you guys have been subjected just to an unbelievable amount of draconian and Orwellian rules since, for a long time, and it's only getting worse. But I would say that that's where the trucker movement started. So I think that's very encouraging as well. And I would also argue, Rich, and I'd love to get your opinion on this. it wasn't for the invasion of Ukraine, I don't know that Trudeau would still be in office. And the reason I say that is because if you think about the timeline there, and I remember this well because I was doing videos on it, that the whole trucker issue was getting to a point, like a tipping point, where it was, mainstream news. Everybody was talking about it, and they had trucker movements that were starting in the United States and in Europe and in Australia, New Zealand, and all these places, kind of following their lead, where people were standing up for freedom and liberty and just their rights as an individual. And then, like the very next week, when this was coming to a climax, and Trudeau was really scrambling around. You can imagine if you were him, you're looking at this saying, holy cow, this is not good here. And that's when he was like running away to his lake house and all that stuff, because he said he got COVID or something.
Yeah.
And then sure enough, you've got Russia invading Ukraine, and all of a sudden, all of the trucker talk disappeared overnight. Well, it went from being the biggest news in the world to no one even mentioned it. And then Trudeau, of course, gets off the hook because now no one's talking about the truckers anymore.
Yeah, so it was a distraction, but I mean, like here in Canada, there was very little media coverage about the truckers. Because,
really?
Yeah, because the federal government funds a lot of mainstream media here.
Oh, wow. Yeah, it was big news here.
Yeah, so anything with like, the beer bug or any of the, the reality of guys like Dr. Malone or McCullough or the conversation with Joe Rogan or any of that stuff was completely, suppressed in the media here for the most part. And the same thing with the truckers. So we didn't get much public coverage of it. And you know how most people are, they just sit there, stare at the TV, and whatever it tells them, they just nod their head and say, yes, this is the new thing that I have to pay attention to. But I don't know. I mean, this guy's won several elections back to back, and every time one comes up and I'm like, oh yeah, he's definitely going out in this one, he gets voted in again, right? And it's like, okay, this is clearly what Canada wants. These are what people want. The voting system here isn't as fragile as the one that you guys have, where they can have like 5, 6, 10, 20 million immigrants mailing cards, or they can duplicate cards, or whatever we've seen happen down in the States that they've covered. But I don't know, man. Like this situation with Trudeau and what happened in Ukraine, I think it was very, very convenient from a world perspective. I think probably, the Psychotic WEF guys and all of those cronies probably played a little bit of a part in distracting the world from what was happening in Canada. But they basically deployed enforcement in Ottawa, and they made the truckers go home. They froze bank accounts, canceled insurance. They just made it very, very uncomfortable for them to be there. Made their lives very difficult. They incarcerated people that they saw as leadership, to make their lives difficult and sort of set an example to it.
But you got the gal in Alberta,
yeah,
that's actually like apologizing and saying that something to the effect that all the people that were for the mandates need to apologize to the unvaccinated because of the trauma we put them through. Isn't there's something like that going on?
Yeah, she's one of those Albertans. Like, Alberta's kind of like Canada's Texas.
Yeah.
They're kind of weird. Like they kind of flip-flop sometimes, but for the most part, it's like Canada's Texas. And I heard that she recently, disavowed the WEF, didn't want to get involved with, like their agendas, was more interested in what's going on, on home turf, which is interesting, but it's not enough. There's not enough, provincial politics. Like the Ontario premier here is supposed to be a conservative, but he fully backed everything that Trudeau did with truckers, convoys, lockdowns, mask mandates, jabs, all that sort of stuff. So,
who else is bad up there? Is that one Hindu guy or whatever that's just
Singh.
Like, is that his name? Yeah.
I actually know Jagmeet Singh personally, because when I was doing the lobbying for Bill 55 back in 2011 to 2013, I met with him several times, and like he lied to me flat out on a number of occasions.
Oh yeah. Well, I've seen things that he's said or put out on Twitter that are just utter nonsense, about inflation being the result of the greedy capitalists. And
he's a smart guy though. Like he's a smart dude. He's a seasoned lawyer. He's very clever. But this is what these politicians and bureaucrats do. Like they're more concerned with the optics than the reality, and it's just.
And I think the guy in the UK is cut from the same cloth That new guy in the
Oh
UK.
he's a puppet.
Yeah,
He is a pawn on the chessboard, and I don't know who's running that chessboard, but it's I wouldn't be surprised if the dots connect somewhere to our buddy Schwab and the others.
yeah,
Let me throw a few more of these up. Hey
sure.
George, won't the economy implode at some point if the Fed has an inflated balance sheet?
An infinite
Sorry,
balance sheet.
infinite balance sheet.
Yeah, but you've got to remember that the Fed, to a certain degree, can backstop all the credit markets. So if this person, how would the economy implode? Let's say, well, you could have a no bid on the Treasury curve. That would be extremely detrimental. You could have the corporate bond market go no bid. Basically, what I'm talking about is credit markets. So if the Fed comes in and backstops that by saying, okay, well, if there's not a bid, or if there's not a bid at a reasonable price, we'll come in and buy it from you, basically backstopping the entire credit market with their balance sheet, that could prevent a complete implosion. Now, that's not to say that it's a solution, because that's just papering over the problem. And when we do finally have to pay the fiddler, the damage is going to be far greater, right? And we're going to have to pay a heavier price. We're just kicking the can down the road. But they do have some tools there that they can use to maybe soften the impact. But what the bond market is telling us right now is that even though they have those tools, we're still going to see a significant recession in 2023. Although if they didn't have those tools, I would argue that we wouldn't have a recession. We'd have an economic depression that would make the 1930s look like a picnic.
Jim's got one here for you. Our national currency is being deliberately debauched to reset 300 trillion global debt via World War III, concurrent with reducing a war would be a lot more effective at reducing the population than what they're doing right now, wouldn't it?
Well, that's what Thomas Malthus argued originally. Rich, he had, I can't remember exactly what he said. He had like two categories of population reduction. One was just voluntary, and he, like birth control and whatnot. He said that's what, and just morally, people should only have one child. And then the other was, he said, just as beneficial, and he was just as much of an advocate, and that was war, famine, and plague. So, yeah, I mean, he would sit there and literally argue the benefits of those three things for humanity long term. That, yeah, we might have this World War II thing, or back then, whatever, the Civil War, World War I, and we might have this Black Plague, we might have the Spanish flu, but you got to look at the bright side here, Rich. That's going to reduce half the population and get us more to an equilibrium with Mother Earth and the amount of resources that we have at our disposal. Again, the exact same argument that Thanos made in that Avenger movie.
There was an infographic somebody put together. I don't know if you ever saw it, but it was a chart going back as far back as recorded history tracked wars. And we live in one of the most peaceful times since World War II right now. Like,
oh yeah,
traditionally in the past, like it was so bizarre because it was like this bar graph. Sorry, it was a 2-axis graph. The amount of wars and then time, and everything prior to like 1945, it was peppered with big dots everywhere. Since 1945, there's been very, very few wars.
Yeah, but what else has happened since 1945, Rich? You got it. Let's think that one through. So remember when I was talking about if you look at a chart of energy use, GDP, and population growth, pretty much since 1950, it's gone parabolic, straight up. We discovered not only all the uses for oil, and then the natural gas, and then we've made that far more efficient, which has allowed that not only the population to grow, but the standard of living to increase. And I would argue that one of the main reasons that you're seeing a reduction in violence or a reduction in war is because you have less civil unrest, because the standard of living has gone up. But let's think about what the global elite want to do. They want to bring down the use of energy. Okay, well, what is that going to do to the standard of living if we know that energy is the economy? It's going to bring back down the standard of living, which makes social unrest increase, which I would argue will most likely lead to more wars in the future, not fewer wars.
So it's entirely possible that they're doing this to set the groundwork for the next world war.
Yeah, and another thing that I'd point out to your audience, Rich, along those lines, is look at what has happened as a result against these just bizarre sanctions against Russia, assuming that you want to defeat Russia and you don't want to defeat your own population, right? The net result has been in the rich countries like Europe, they're using a lot less energy. Okay, what was their number one objective? Use less energy. And then what's a secondary effect? Well, natural gas, the price goes parabolic. Okay, what's the main input into fertilizer? That would be
Nitrogen.
natural gas,
Wasn't
right?
nice.
So then you have less fertilizer. And if you do have it, you have it at a much higher price. Okay, well, what does that do to food availability in the poorer countries? It reduces it. So you have food shortages, which does what to the population? It decreases population growth. So again, I'm not saying that this is deliberate, but I'm saying let's just connect some dots here, for heaven's sakes. And if their explicit objectives are less energy and lower population, and all of these policies that they're implementing right now just so happen to achieve those objectives, maybe, just maybe, these policies are intentional, not to defeat Russia, but to go back to this Malthusian cult.
Let me ask you this question. I mean, Joe Biden's clearly not in charge. Like, he just walks around aimlessly, right? Like, you know, the motor's running, but nobody's really behind the wheel, sort of thing.
Yeah, or when he's shaking hands with like nobody.
So who's running this? Who's running the most influential and powerful country in the world right now?
Great question. I think it's just the establishment, let's say. But what is the establishment?
Yeah, if you can define
I think
that.
it's just really the influence from the groups that we've been talking about, the Davos types, these people that have the Great Reset agenda, if you will, the people that are on board, whether it's the global elite, the do-gooders, or the useful idiots. It's this whole constituency, and I think that is what's really the driving force behind pretty much all politics in the United States, but definitely the Democratic Party and whoever the puppeteer is that's pulling the strings with Joe Biden. That would be my guess. And then I think they're heavily influenced by corporate America, especially the pharmaceutical companies. And I think we saw that play out in 2020 and 2021. And we still see that today when Fauci gets up there, and regardless of any evidence that we have, he'll still come out there and say the number one thing that you can do. In fact, his crony the other day, the guy that works for him or works in his department or something, says that's the whole reason that you've got two arms. So you can get a cerveza sickness shot or a beer bug shot in this arm and all your boosters. And in this arm, you can get your flu shot. That's why God gave you two arms. That's literally what he said on national TV.
I know. George, when's the next Rebel Capitalist Live?
It's going to be May, the beginning of May in Orlando. And we're going to be announcing that in about a week or two.
Cool. And would you get into commercial real estate in the U.S. right now?
No. Just because of the yield curve. I think you're going to have a better opportunity in a couple years.
What if you're not in service? How can you survive war? I think, well, let's just rephrase this, because we should probably wind down the cast and sort of wrap it up. But given everything that we've talked about, what would you recommend people do with this knowledge now? Like, what are some solutions to these problems? Because I like actionable sort of stuff.
Yeah, for sure. I think that it depends on the resources that you have access to, and it depends on your personal situation. Like, as an example, I'm a single guy. I don't have a wife. I don't have kids. And I've got a significant amount of resources. So for me, in my opinion, the best thing I can do is just be completely mobile and just plan things out in 6-month segments. Because 6 months from now, I have no idea what the world is going to look like. A lot of people, I'm in Medellin, Colombia right now. I've spent a lot of time here since 2014. and they say, well, is Colombia a good place to move, and bring my family and to do, set up shop for the next 10 years? I have no idea. I like it now. I might not like it in 6 months. They just elected a socialist here as well, Petro. So, and the world is changing so quickly that I think it's impossible to determine where you're going to be able to maximize your freedom and liberty in 5 years, or maybe even a year or two. So if you're someone like me, I think it's wise just to set up shop, like our buddy Andrew Henderson says, right now, wherever it is that you're treated best based on your priorities, but then remain very flexible and just kind of take it in 6-month segments. Now, if you're a normal person that, let's say, is making 75 grand a year, and you're, you got a wife and kids, and you just can't just move to Dubai or something like that, then I think you need to really be focused on community. You need to really set up a network of like-minded individuals that are in your neighborhood, in your town, in your city. And you really need to get on the same page and maybe meet up once or twice a month and say, hey, if so-and-so happens, let's set up a game plan here. Let's have a plan B. And, what's our downside there? I'd also, I would definitely have 6 months of food. Definitely. And then I don't want to go too much into the portfolio, but I would like to see a 10% allocation to gold just as an insurance policy. And then, what I did with my sister when we were going into this, when Russia invaded Ukraine, and she lives in Dallas, by the way. And this is what I'd suggest to your audience as well, is think through the probabilities of XYZ event that you're concerned about, right? And then say, okay, if this played out, what would I do? So going back to this story of my sister, I called her and I said, listen, this could get really serious. Russia just invaded Ukraine. They got 6,000 nuclear missiles pointed at us. I said, Lise, you need to figure out where in Mexico you would go, because that's your nearest border there. And, get your SUV, jam it packed full of dried food or whatever, can sustain you for a couple months. And then just figure out on a map, where do you want to go in Mexico, and how would you get there if you had to go there in a moment's notice? And then she just had that plan B. Now you could say, George, that's paranoid and that's this. Okay, fine. But what's your downside there? And I think that we will also see a lot more civil and social unrest in the United States and maybe in Canada, like we saw in 2020. And therefore, to have some sort of bug out plan, I think would be prudent as well. As an example there, my buddy in the United States in Phoenix, he bought a little RV that he keeps in his driveway. So if there's riots like we did see in Scottsdale, that he can just hop in his RV and he can shoot up to the mountains for a week or two and just wait till the smoke clears and then decide what he wants to do from there. So he's protecting his family and the people who he really cares about. So those are probably the first steps that I'd take. But the main thing is just to be aware. Make sure that you're not whistling by the graveyard, and make sure that you just don't have your head buried in the sand.
When it comes to being aware, where would you recommend people get their information from?
Oh, I'd watch Ron Paul's channel. I'd watch your channel. If people want to watch the Rebel Capitalist channel, I talk about this stuff pretty much every single day. And then from there, I'm sure you'll find other content creators who are just as good, if not better, than we are. Tom Woods is another podcast, the Tom Woods Show, that I really enjoy. But just get out there online and look for people that are preaching the message of freedom, liberty, and free market capitalism, and just see the ones that you relate to the most, and just listen to what they say.
And one last question for you. What do you think of Henry Hazlitt's book, Economics in One Lesson?
Love it. Suggest it to everybody.
Okay. There you have it, guys. If you want to get more from George Gammon, check him out on YouTube and on Twitter. George Gammon on YouTube, Rebel Capitalist on YouTube, Twitter, George Gammon. You'll be able to find him pretty easily if you just search for it in the search bar. Rich and George is one of the best ever productions on the YouTube network. People are finally waking up to reality. You're welcome. So We'll get together again soon, my friend. I really like having you on as a guest and, having these conversations. It's been a blast. If you guys enjoyed it, leave a thumbs up and a comment below. And yeah, make sure you check out George for a little bit more.